Snow fell so thick it seemed to bury the mountain itself. The wind tore through the pines, howling like something alive, carrying with it the scent of blood and frost. Through the storm staggered a bobcat, thin, soaked, limping, her fur clumped with ice and streaked red along her flank. Every breath was a shudder, every step a fight against the cold that wanted her still. The cries of her cubs had faded hours ago. Now there was only silence, broken by her claws scraping at the frozen ground, digging where the scent lingered. Each time she stopped to listen, hope flickered, then died again in the wind. She pressed her nose to the snow, desperate for warmth, for life, for anything. But all she tasted was iron and salt. Her sides heaved, she stumbled, fell hard, and for a moment didn't rise. Blood spread slowly beneath her, a bloom of red in the endless white. Then she saw it, a faint glow through the storm, golden, trembling, impossible. A light that didn't belong to the forest. A cabin. The wind hissed around her as she dragged herself toward it. Her paw prints, streaked with blood, marked the snow behind her like a trail of grief. Somewhere deep inside, a voice, older than thought, older than fear, whispered, "Go." When she reached the porch, her body gave out. The smell of wood smoke filled her nose, a warmth she hadn't known in weeks. She lifted her head once more, eyes glassy with exhaustion. Through the small window came the flicker of firelight and the shadow of a man. Inside, an old man sat beside a hearth, the orange glow tracing the deep lines of his face. Outside, just beyond his door, a creature lay dying in the snow. The boards creaked as he stood. A pause, then the slow, uncertain sound of boots crossing the floor. The latch clicked. The door opened with a soft cry of hinges, letting out a wave of warmth that brushed against her trembling body. The man froze. The bobcat stared back, her breath coming in shallow bursts, eyes wide and wild, but not cruel. She tried to growl, but the sound came out as a rasp, half plea, half surrender. For a long moment, neither moved. Snow swirled between them, caught in the beam of the porch light like falling ash. He could have shut the door. He should have. But something in her eyes, something raw and broken, held him still. It was a look he'd seen once before, in another life, on a night that had never stopped haunting him. Slowly, he stepped forward, the boards creaking beneath his weight. His hand, rough and calloused, reached out through the curtain of snow. The bobcat did not move. The storm raged around them, erasing tracks, swallowing sound. But inside that small circle of light, between man and beast, something unseen stirred, fragile, trembling, alive. Outside, winter devoured the mountain. Inside, something just began to thaw. Mornings in the valley came slow. The sun, when it finally showed itself, crept over the ridge like it was afraid to disturb the silence. Frost clung to the window panes of the small cabin, each pattern different, like tiny maps of places that no longer existed. Elias sat at the table, the same place he had every morning for the past 3 winters. The chair across from him remained empty. He still set a cup there, out of habit, though he no longer remembered when he'd stopped pouring coffee into it. Outside, the forest groaned beneath the weight of snow. Inside, the only sound was the ticking of a clock that had long since stopped keeping time. He'd once lived in the city, long ago when his wife Miriam was alive, and laughter still had a place in his house. But after the accident, the storm that had taken her and their little boy, Elias left it all behind. The house, the job, the neighbors who spoke in whispers when he passed. He sold everything and moved north, to the place where noise couldn't find him. People in the nearest town, 15 miles away, said the mountain had swallowed him. Maybe it had. He spoke to no one except the old dog that slept by the fire. Even that, lately, felt like too much. He worked with his hands, split wood, fixed things that didn't need fixing. He built birdhouses and never hung them, carved small wooden animals and lined them along the windowsill. Fox, deer, owl, bear. None looked quite right, but he kept making them anyway. Sometimes, when the wind rose, he thought he heard his son's laughter carried through the trees. He'd look up from his work, the chisel still in his hand, and listen. But it always faded before he could be sure. The forest was alive in ways he no longer understood. Tracks appeared overnight. Coyote, elk, sometimes something stranger. He'd grown used to their company, even found comfort in it. They belonged. He didn't. That evening, as dusk spilled through the trees, Elias sat by the fire, flipping through an old photo album. The pages were yellowed, edges curled by years of smoke. He ran a thumb over one photograph, his wife holding their son on a sled, snow falling soft around them. The fire cracked, spitting sparks. Elias didn't look up. He didn't see the shadow moving past the window, didn't hear the soft thud outside the door. Not yet, but soon. Outside, snow began to fall again. Quiet, patient, endless. And somewhere in that white silence, a wounded creature dragged itself toward his light. The dog stirred first. A low growl rumbled in its throat, half warning, half confusion. Elias looked up from the photo album, his eyes adjusting to the dim firelight. The sound came again, sharper this time, and then the dog's ears flattened against its head. Something was outside. Elias reached for the rifle that leaned against the wall. He didn't need to think. Years alone in the mountains had made such movements instinct. He slipped on his coat, opened the door, and froze. The world beyond the threshold was white and endless. Snowflakes spun in the wind like tiny ghosts. At first, he saw nothing. Then, in the dim wash of the porch light, he saw it. A shape curled at the edge of the steps, half covered in snow. A bobcat. Its chest rose in shallow, ragged breaths. Blood had frozen along its side, a thin crust of ice clinging to the wound. Its eyes, half open, caught the light just long enough for him to see something he couldn't name. Fear, yes, but not the kind he'd seen in wild animals before. This one looked lost. Elias lowered the rifle. For a long moment he stood there, the wind biting at his face, torn between the instinct to turn away and the old ache that refused to let him. The dog whined behind him. The fire inside crackled, a single ember snapping in the silence. He stepped forward. The bobcat didn't move. Its body trembled once, weakly. Elias crouched, snow crunching beneath his knees, and looked closer. The creature's fur was tangled with burrs, its paws raw from ice. He could see the ribs beneath the skin. It should have been dead already. But somehow, it had found his door. Jesus, he muttered, though the word came out softer than a prayer. He hesitated, watching the slow rise and fall of the creature's chest. He'd seen death before, too much of it. He knew how to let things go, but this one felt different. Maybe because it was winter again. Maybe because he was tired of losing things. Elias set down the rifle. He moved back inside, grabbed an old wool blanket from the chair, and returned to the porch. The wind whipped at his face as he knelt again. The dog barked once, uneasy. "It's okay," Elias whispered, more to himself than to the animal. "It's just for tonight." He wrapped the blanket around the bobcat as best he could, careful not to touch the wound. Its breath hitched, then steadied, faintly. He could feel its warmth through the fabric, faint but real. When he lifted it, it weighed almost nothing. A ghost with fur. Inside, the fire cast long shadows across the room. He laid the bobcat near the hearth, unsure if he'd just done something kind or foolish. The dog circled twice, then lay down, watching with wary eyes. Elias sat beside the fire again. The photo album still lay open on the table, the picture of his family staring back at him. He didn't close it this time. Outside, the storm thickened. Inside, the house was no longer silent. By morning, the storm had quieted. The cabin was dim, the kind of gray light that came before dawn, when everything felt like a half-remembered dream. Elias woke to the sound of movement, a soft rustle near the hearth. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it. Then he saw the blanket shift. The bobcat was alive. It lifted its head weakly, eyes blinking against the dim light. For the first time, he saw them clearly, amber and sharp, but clouded with pain. It tried to rise, its claws scraping the floorboards, then collapsed again, panting. Elias crouched beside it, keeping his voice low. "Easy now. You're safe." He didn't know why he said it. Safe was a word that didn't mean much out here. He fetched a bowl of water, sliding it closer. The bobcat stared at it, then at him, as if trying to decide what he was. After a long hesitation, it leaned forward and drank, slow, deliberate sips. The sight stirred something in him. It had been years since he'd seen any creature trust him that way. When he moved to check the wound, the animal flinched but didn't strike. The gash along its ribs was shallow but ragged, probably from a fall or a rock slide. He cleaned it gently, wrapping it with an old shirt. The bobcat's breath trembled under his touch, but it didn't pull away. He noticed something strange in its fur. Small, dried patches of blood along the chest and neck. Different color. Older. He brushed them away, frowning. The scent was faint but familiar. Milk. Elias froze. He'd grown up on a farm. He knew that smell. It wasn't from the bobcat's own wound. It was from something or someone it had been carrying. He looked toward the door, the snow still piled high outside. "You've got cubs out there, don't you?" he murmured. The bobcat's ears twitched at his voice, as if she understood. She turned her head toward the window, eyes fixed on the white wilderness beyond. A low, broken sound escaped her throat, something between a growl and a cry. That was when he knew she hadn't come here to die. She'd come here because there was nowhere else left to go. Elias sat back, staring at her. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. A part of him wanted to look away, to let nature take its course. That was the rule of the wild, wasn't it? You don't interfere. But rules hadn't saved his family. He looked again at the bobcat. The rise and fall of her breath, the faint tremor in her body. In that frail, desperate thing, he saw his own reflection. The look of someone who had lost everything, yet refused to stop searching. Outside, the sky began to brighten, pale and cold. Elias exhaled, a long, heavy sound. "All right," he whispered. "Let's find them." The bobcat's eyes flicked toward him, unblinking. For the first time, he thought he saw something that wasn't fear. It was hope. The forest was still when he stepped outside. Snow blanketed everything, smoothing the world into silence. The only sound was the crunch of his boots and the faint, uneven prints that followed beside him. The bobcat limped close, her breath clouding in the cold. She moved slower now, weakened, but her eyes never stopped scanning the white. Every few steps she'd stop, nose twitching, ears turning. Elias followed her lead, though he wasn't sure what he was looking for. Prints, maybe, or a sound, or just a sign that this wasn't hopeless. He hadn't walked this far from the cabin in months. The cold bit through his gloves, stinging his fingers, but he didn't turn back. There was something about this, about her, that wouldn't let him. At the edge of the clearing, the bobcat stopped. She let out a low, almost human sound, half mournful, half calling. The sound broke through the air and vanished into the trees. No answer came. Elias felt the ache of it in his chest. He crouched beside her, studying the snow. There, faint impressions, smaller than her own, leading downhill toward the frozen creek. Cub tracks, partially buried by the night storm, but still there. "Good girl," he muttered under his breath, pointing. They went this way. She turned her head toward him, eyes glinting like amber glass. And for a heartbeat, he swore she understood. They followed the trail together. The slope was steep, the snow deep. Elias slipped once, his knee striking a rock, but he didn't stop. The prints were fading fast under the new snowfall. At the bottom of the hill, the tracks scattered near a fallen pine. The trunk had split open, half buried under ice. Elias crouched again, brushing away snow with his gloved hands. Something dark glinted beneath the bark, fur, but it wasn't moving. He froze. The bobcat pushed past him, sniffing frantically, then let out a sound so raw it made the hair rise on his neck. She nosed the small, still body half buried beneath the snow. One cub. No breath. Elias looked away, throat tight. He didn't need to check the rest to know what she'd find. The storm had taken them. The bobcat didn't leave. She pressed her head against the cub's tiny form, the same way a mother might hush a child who'd fallen asleep. Snow began to fall again, slow and merciless. He couldn't watch anymore. He turned, staring into the distance where the trees blurred into mist. For the first time in years, he felt something hot rise in his chest. Not grief, not yet, but anger. The kind that burned behind the ribs, the kind that demanded he do something. He looked back at this bobcat. She was trembling, her fur dusted white, her breath ragged. "Come on," he whispered. "You can't stay here." When she didn't move, he knelt, reaching toward her like he had that first night. "Hey, you did what you could." The words caught in his throat. Maybe he was saying them to himself. Finally, the bobcat looked up, eyes hollow but alive. She turned from the bodies and limped toward him. Together, they climbed back up the hill, two shadows against the snow, each carrying their own ghosts. Behind them, the wind covered the tracks, erasing everything except the memory of where hope had once been. The days after the storm blurred into one long silence. The world outside the cabin was frozen solid. Trees sheathed in ice, the creek sealed beneath a glassy crust. Inside, the fire burned almost constantly, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and pine. The bobcat stayed near the hearth. She moved little, sleeping most of the time, her breath soft and even. The wound along her side was healing, though she still limped when she stood. Elias kept his distance at first. He didn't speak much, didn't know what to say. He just went about his chores, chopping wood, melting snow for water, feeding the fire. Every so often, he'd glance over, half expecting her to vanish like a dream, but she didn't. Sometimes, she watched him the way wild things do, head low, eyes sharp, unreadable. And yet, there was no threat in her gaze, just quiet awareness. One morning, while he was mending a chair by the fire, she stood and crossed the room, her movements slow but certain. She stopped a few feet away, sniffing at the wooden leg he was sanding. Elias froze, unsure what to do. Then she brushed past him, light as a whisper, and curled up near his boots. He let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Guess we're both running out of better company," he muttered. The dog, sprawled nearby, lifted its head, and gave him a look that said, "You're crazy." Elias couldn't help but smile, something he hadn't done in months. He started leaving scraps of meat by the hearth. At first, she wouldn't eat until he left the room. But slowly, day by day, the distance closed. She began to eat while he was still there, then began to stay even after the meal was gone. Trust, he realized, was a slow thing. You couldn't force it. You could only earn it. Sometimes at night, Elias woke to strange sounds, the soft padding of paws, the creak of the floorboards. He'd open his eyes and see her pacing near the door, restless, staring out into the white darkness. He knew what she was thinking. He'd seen that same look in the mirror once. One night, he spoke without thinking. "They're gone," he said quietly, voice barely more than breath. "You can't find them now." The bobcat turned, golden eyes catching the firelight. For a second, he thought she might snarl. Instead, she sat, tail curling around her paws, and just looked at him. Something passed between them then. Something small but unmistakable. Understanding, maybe, or just shared loneliness. When morning came, he found her asleep beside the old dog, both breathing slow and steady. The sight made his chest ache in a way he couldn't name. Later that week, Elias ventured into town for supplies, the first time in months. The storekeeper, a broad man with a beard gone gray, raised a brow when he saw him. "Didn't think you'd survive the winter up there," he said. "Folks been saying a wildcat's been prowling near your ridge. You seen anything?" Elias hesitated. "Can't say I have." "Careful, old man," the shopkeeper warned. "Those things get hungry this time of year. Last week they tore through a chicken coop. You'd be smart to keep that rifle close." Elias nodded, forcing a polite smile. He bought flour, matches, a new knife blade, and a small bag of jerky he didn't really need. That night, back in the cabin, he placed a piece of jerky near the fire. The bobcat sniffed it once, then looked at him as if to say, "You went through trouble for this?" He laughed, shaking his head. "You're welcome, lady." She ate anyway. Outside, snow fell again. But this time, the house didn't feel so empty. Winter deepened. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the cold, somehow, found new ways to hurt. But inside the cabin, there was warmth, a fragile kind, the sort that lived only because two broken things had decided not to give up on each other. Elias had stopped locking the door at night. The bobcat came and went as she pleased, padding silently through the snow, returning before dawn to curl near the fire. Sometimes she brought back bits of rabbit or grouse. Once she dropped a dead squirrel beside his boots, as if offering tribute. He chuckled softly. "You don't owe me rent, sweetheart." She blinked once, slow and unimpressed, then turned away. The dog had grown used to her by now. They even shared the same rug, an unspoken truce between species. Elias, watching them, often felt like the outsider in his own home. But there were moments, small ones, that made him believe he was healing. The way she would lift her head when he spoke, or how her eyes followed him when he stepped outside. The way the silence felt less heavy. One afternoon, Elias hiked down to the frozen creek to fetch water. The air was sharp enough to cut. He filled his pail, pausing to rest, when he noticed something unusual. Boot prints. Not his. Fresh. He followed them with his eyes toward the tree line. Smoke curled from the direction of the logging road. People had been nearby. Back in town, word must have spread. The talk about a wildcat near his ridge. Hungry, dangerous, maybe rabid. Men who'd lost livestock were eager to find someone or something to blame. That night, as the fire burned low, Elias heard the distant echo of a gunshot. Then another. The bobcat lifted her head, ears pricked, muscles tensing. Her pupils widened to dark pools. Elias's stomach turned cold. He set his cup down, listening. The shots came again, farther off but unmistakable. "Hunters, it's all right," he said quietly, though it wasn't. She didn't relax. Her body was taut, her breath quick. The dog whined, sensing the change. Elias rose, moved to the window, and peered out. The forest was black and endless, but somewhere out there, men with rifles were moving through it. Men who wouldn't hesitate to shoot a shadow if it looked like a threat. He turned back to her. "You can't go out tonight," he said. The bobcat stared, as if weighing his words. Then she lay back down, but her tail flicked, restless. He didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside, the wind, a branch snapping, the groan of the trees, made him sit up, listening. Once he thought he saw movement near the tree line, a flicker of light, but it was gone before he could be sure. By morning, a thin layer of ash lay across the snow outside the cabin. Campfire remains. Whoever had been there had left before dawn. The bobcat paced near the door, uneasy. Elias stepped outside, scanning the ridge. Nothing moved except the wind. Still, the forest felt different now, less like solitude, more like being watched. He went about his day, chopping wood, fixing the fence, keeping busy. But the air never settled. The peace he'd built, quiet, delicate, impossible, felt suddenly temporary. That evening, as he poured stew into a tin bowl, he caught himself speaking without thinking. "They'll come up here one of these days. If they see you, they won't ask questions." The bobcat lifted her head. Her eyes met his. She didn't look afraid, only certain. Something inside him twisted. He realized he'd started saying they, not we. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing himself as part of them. The wind rattled the cabin walls. The dog barked once, low. Elias stood staring into the fire. He thought of his wife again, of how she used to say the world was never cruel, only scared. Maybe that's what all of this was. People afraid of what they didn't understand. He turned back to the bobcat, her fur glowing in the firelight, eyes steady on his. "Well," he murmured, "guess fear's got another thing coming." Outside, snow began to fall again, thick and endless. And somewhere in the forest below, men loaded their guns. The snow didn't stop for 3 days. It buried the path to town, swallowed the fence line, and turned the world into something soft and merciless. Elias stayed inside, tending the fire, rationing the food, and listening to the wind. The bobcat slept near the hearth, her breathing slow and steady. Sometimes, when she dreamed, her paws twitched as if she were running. He wondered if she dreamed of the forest, of the cubs she'd lost, or of something else entirely, something she still hoped to find. On the 4th day, the storm broke. The sky turned a pale blue, sharp as glass. Elias opened the door and stepped into a silence so deep it hummed in his ears. That's when he saw it. Tracks, human boots, leading straight to his porch. He followed them a few yards downhill. They stopped near a tree stump where the snow was disturbed, the wood chipped, signs of someone waiting there, watching. When he turned back toward the cabin, his stomach tightened. A dark shape sat at the window, the bobcat, watching him. She knew. That night, Elias lit no fire. He sat by the window with the rifle across his lap, the dog curled at his feet. Outside, the forest was a graveyard of white and shadow. Every few minutes, he thought he heard something, a distant crunch, a flicker of movement, but it could have just been the wind. Near midnight, the bobcat rose and pressed her nose to the door. A low sound rumbled in her chest. Elias shook his head. "No, not tonight," She turned toward him, tail lashing, restless. He saw it in her eyes, fear and fury tangled together. The same look he'd worn once, when the rescuers told him there was nothing left to find. The boards creaked as she stepped closer, slow, deliberate. She sat beside him, their reflections meeting in the window, man and beast, both trapped by the same kind of loneliness. Elias whispered, "You're not just some animal to them. You're a threat." The words tasted bitter, because he knew he wasn't talking only about her. Morning came gray and brittle. Smoke curled from somewhere down the valley. The hunters were moving again. Elias fed the dog, checked his traps, and gathered a few things into a pack, just in case. When he came back inside, the bobcat was gone. The door was cracked open, a line of paw prints leading into the trees. "God damn it," he muttered, pulling on his coat. The forest was hushed, almost reverent. He followed the tracks through the drifts, calling out though he knew it was pointless. The prints wove through the pines, past the creek, up toward the ridge. Then he heard it, a gunshot, close. Elias froze, heart hammering. Another shot echoed, then silence. He ran, branches whipped at his face, snow flying with every step. He stumbled into a clearing and saw them. Two men with rifles, smoke still curling from the barrels. One pointed toward the trees. "There! I saw her!" Elias didn't think. "Hey!" he shouted, storming forward. "Put those damn things down!" Both turned, startled. One frowned. "Elias? What the hell are you doing up here?" "She's mine," he said, though he knew how crazy it sounded. "You don't touch her." The taller man laughed, shaking his head. "Yours? You lose your mind, old man? That thing's been killing livestock for weeks." "She hasn't hurt anyone," Elias snapped. "She's just trying to survive." The shorter hunter spat into the snow. "You keep feeding it, it'll stop being scared of people. Then it'll come for kids next." Elias stepped between them and the tree line, chest heaving. "Then you'll have to shoot through me first." A long silence hung between them, sharp as ice. Finally, the men lowered their rifles. "You want her blood on your conscience. That's your problem," one muttered. "But when she comes for someone, don't say we didn't warn you." They turned and left, boots crunching through the snow. Elias stood there long after they were gone, breath burning in his chest. Then he heard it, a faint rustle behind him. He turned. The bobcat stood at the edge of the clearing, watching him with those amber eyes, alive, unhurt. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she stepped forward, brushing past his leg. Elias exhaled shakily. "Guess we're both still wanted out here." They walked back toward the cabin together, the wind rising around them. Behind them, the world was white and endless. And somewhere far below, voices carried through the valley, angry, afraid, human. The bond was real now, which meant the danger was too. The thaw came late that year. Snow melted slow and uneven, pooling in the hollows and turning the trails into rivers of mud. The forest smelled different, wet bark, cold earth, something waking beneath the frost. Elias felt it too. The stillness that had carried them through winter was slipping away. The bobcat came and went freely now, leaner, stronger. Sometimes she disappeared for days, then returned at dawn, fur dusted with pine needles, eyes wild and bright. She would sit at the porch, watching him split wood, and he'd talk to her like she could answer. "You're gonna leave soon," he said one morning, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's what spring does, sends everything back where it belongs." She blinked, slow and silent. He smiled faintly. "Don't look at me like that. I'll be fine." But they both knew he wouldn't. That afternoon, he walked to the ridge to check his traps. From there, he could see the valley, the thin smoke from distant chimneys, the logging road winding like a scar through the trees. Something caught his eye. A group of men near the tree line, their coats dark against the snowmelt. They were moving toward his direction. Elias's stomach sank. By nightfall, the sounds reached his cabin. Voices, the clatter of boots, the bark of a dog. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, heart pounding. 3 men emerged from the woods, lanterns swinging. The one in front, the storekeeper from town, raised a hand. "Evening, Elias." "What's this?" Elias asked, though he already knew. "Got reports of that wildcat again," the man said. "Killed a sheep 2 farms down. Thought we'd take a look up here. Mind if we check around?" "She hasn't hurt anyone," Elias said. His voice cracked. "Leave her be." The men exchanged looks. One of them smirked. "Her? You been keeping that thing here, haven't you?" Elias's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" the man said, stepping closer. "Tracks lead right to your door. You think folks don't notice? You're endangering people, old man." The dog growled low from the porch. Elias didn't move. "You'll find nothing here," the storekeeper sighed. "I like you, Elias, but this ain't personal. That cat's a threat. We got kids in this valley." Before Elias could answer, a sound cut through the air. A sharp crack from behind the cabin. The men spun around. A flash of movement. The bobcat. She'd come back. Too soon, too bold. "Get it!" someone shouted. The world exploded. Shouts, boots, the roar of a gun. Elias dropped his rifle and ran. "No!" But it was too late. A net snapped open. Weighted and fast. The bobcat snarled, twisting, claws flashing, but the men held firm. Elias shoved one aside, earning a punch to the ribs that knocked the wind from him. "Stop!" he gasped, stumbling forward. "She's not dangerous." The storekeeper's face hardened. "You don't get to decide that anymore." They dragged the struggling animal toward the sled. Her eyes found Elias's through the mesh, wide, frantic, pleading. He tried to reach her. Someone pulled him back. The door of the cage slammed shut. For a heartbeat, the forest went silent again. The only sound left was her breathing, fast, desperate. And then even that began to fade beneath the wind. The forest was quieter after they took her. Too quiet. Elias spent the next day walking in circles around the cabin, listening for sounds that weren't there. The soft padding of paws, the low rumble in her chest when the fire popped too loud. The silence pressed against him like a weight. Even the old dog seemed smaller, unsure what to do with the empty space. The men had left ruts in the snow, deep grooves from the sled. He followed them for miles that morning, down the ridge, through the clearing, until his breath turned to smoke and his legs shook from the cold. When the tracks merged with the main road, he stopped. The cage would be miles away by now, maybe in the village, maybe already gone. He stood there a long time, staring at the trail like it could give him an answer. But the wind filled it in grain by grain, erasing everything. Back at the cabin, he couldn't bring himself to light the fire. The air felt wrong with warmth in it. He sat at the table, hands wrapped around an empty mug, and watched the shadows crawl across the walls. It was the same kind of stillness that had filled the house after the accident years ago. He remembered how he'd gone days without speaking, waiting for a voice that would never come back. Now it was happening again. By evening, someone knocked at the door. He didn't answer. The knock came again. Then a voice. "Elias, it's Tom, the storekeeper." Elias opened the door just enough to see him standing there, hat in his hands, expression uneasy. "She's being taken to the warden's station," Tom said. They'll put her down tomorrow. I thought you should know." Elias's jaw clenched. "You should have left her alone." Tom sighed. "We can't, and you know it. She's a wild animal. You can't save something that doesn't belong here." Elias looked at him for a long time, eyes hollow. "Maybe neither do I." He shut the door. When the sound of boots faded, Elias leaned against the wood and closed his eyes. He could still see her face through the bars, confused, not angry, the way her eyes had searched for him until the sled disappeared. That night, the wind rose again. The old dog pressed close to his leg, whining softly, as if sensing what he was thinking. He whispered, "I could go after her," but he didn't move, not yet. Instead, he opened the photo album, the one he hadn't touched since before she came. His fingers lingered on the picture of his son, the same small face that haunted every winter, the same helplessness. He'd lost once because he'd waited too long. He couldn't do it again. Elias stood, grabbed his coat, and reached for the rifle. The wind howled as he stepped outside, the door slamming behind him. Somewhere far down the valley, a dog barked, followed by the echo of chains. The world was turning colder again. In the dark, he whispered her name, though she never had one. And then he started walking. The road to the warden's station wound through the valley like an old scar. Elias walked it alone, boots crunching over frozen mud, breath white in the early dawn. He hadn't slept. The rifle hung over his shoulder, useless against the kind of cruelty he was walking toward. By the time he reached the clearing, the sun had climbed just high enough to touch the roofs of the buildings with pale light. The station sat at the edge of the forest, half wood, half steel, the kind of place built for things no one wanted to remember. A man stood outside, coat buttoned to the neck, cigarette burning between his fingers. The warden. Elias approached slowly. "I'm here for the Bobcat," he said, voice rough. The warden squinted. "You're the one kept her up in the hills?" Elias didn't answer. The man exhaled smoke through his nose. "Can't let you near her. Orders came down this morning. Animal control's on their way. They'll take care of it." "Take care of it," Elias repeated, the words tasting like ash. "You mean kill her?" The warden didn't reply. Through the narrow window behind him, Elias saw the cage. She was there, smaller than he remembered, curled in the corner, her fur matted from snow and wire. When she lifted her head, their eyes met. Something inside him broke. He stepped forward, but the warden blocked his path. "Don't, Elias. I know you mean well, but she's not some pet. You can't save what's wild." Elias's voice cracked. "You think I don't know that? I'm not trying to tame her. I'm trying to let her live." The warden sighed, glancing toward the woods. "You need to go home. There's nothing here for you anymore." Elias stared at him for a long moment, then turned away. He walked to the edge of the clearing, stopping just before the tree line. His heart was pounding, every beat a hammer of memory. His wife's voice, his boy's laughter, the crash of the storm years ago. He couldn't lose another life to silence. Without thinking, he moved. He crossed the yard in seconds, slammed his shoulder into the door, and burst into the dim room. The bobcat flinched, eyes wide. The cage latch snapped open under his shaking hands. "Come on," he whispered. "Go." She didn't move, just stared at him, trembling. Then footsteps thundered behind him. "Elias, don't!" Hands grabbed his coat, yanking him back. The rifle clattered to the floor. Someone shouted, someone else cursed, and the cage door slammed shut again with a sound that cut through him like glass. He fell to his knees, gasping. The warden's voice echoed above him, distant and sharp. "You're done here, old man. Go home before I have you locked up too." Elias didn't hear the rest. His gaze stayed fixed on her. She was pressed against the bars, breathing hard, her eyes locked on his. No anger, no fear, just confusion. He reached out, fingertips brushing cold steel. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Outside, the engine of a truck started. The men began loading the cage. Snow swirled in the air, catching in her fur. Elias stood motionless, watching as they lifted her away. The last thing he saw was her tail disappearing into the back of the truck. The last thing he heard was the slam of the door, then only wind. The mountain took his family once. This time, it was taking what was left of his soul. The storm had passed, but the wind still carried smoke. When Elias reached the ridge again, the horizon was orange, an ugly, hungry glow climbing the dark. The forest was burning. He hadn't meant to return there that night, but his feet had led him back before his mind caught up. The warden's words echoed in his skull. You can't save what's wild, and yet he couldn't let them be true. The bobcat was somewhere out there, maybe still alive, maybe not. But he had to know. He climbed the ridge fast, lungs burning. Every step up through the drifts tore at his legs. The air grew thicker, heavy with the smell of pine and ash. In the distance, the flames leapt from tree to tree, roaring like an animal that didn't care who it devoured. When he reached the clearing, he saw the truck, overturned, half buried in snow and smoke. A tree had fallen across the road. The cage in the back was twisted open. Elias's heart lurched. He called out, coughing, "Hey, anybody here?" No answer. Only the crackle of fire and the moan of the wind through the pines. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A cry. Not human. He followed it through the haze, stumbling over roots and ash. The heat licked at his face, smoke stinging his eyes. And then, through the blur, he saw her. The bobcat lay near the fallen truck, tangled in the wreckage. Her fur was scorched, breath ragged. One leg caught between metal bars. She lifted her head when she saw him, weak, confused, but alive. Elias dropped to his knees. "Oh God, you're still here." He reached for the bars, trying to pry them apart, but they were bent and hot. The skin on his palms burned. He gritted his teeth, pulling harder until his arms shook. The metal groaned, but didn't give. A gust of wind blew, carrying sparks toward them. The flames were moving closer, devouring everything in their path. "Come on, damn it!" Elias shouted, wrenching the metal again. This time it snapped. The bobcat yelped, jerking free. She tried to stand, stumbled, then limped toward him, pressing her head against his arm. For a moment, time stopped. The fire, the smoke, the pain, all of it blurred into one heartbeat of recognition. He wrapped his coat around her and lifted her as best he could. She wasn't heavy, but his body screamed in protest. The heat was unbearable now. Trees cracked and fell in bursts of flame around them. Elias staggered down the hill, half blind. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one filled with smoke. The bobcat stirred weakly in his arms, and he kept whispering to her between breaths. "Almost there. Just hold on." The ground gave way beneath him, soft snow melting into mud. He fell, sliding down a ravine. The world spun, pain flared bright, then faded to gray. When he opened his eyes, everything was quiet again. The fire hadn't reached this far yet. The air was thick with haze, but the cold ground felt real beneath him. The bobcat was lying a few feet away, breathing shallowly. She lifted her head, eyes catching the last bit of light. Elias crawled toward her, reaching out. "We made it," he said, voice hoarse. "You're safe." In the distance, something cracked, the sound of the fire changing direction. The wind shifted, bringing the flames downhill. He looked at the trees above, at the glowing line of fire creeping closer, and realized what he had to do. There was an old creek bed nearby, dry but deep. He dragged himself toward it, pulled her along gently, and lay down beside her in the hollow, covering them both with his coat. The heat roared overhead. Smoke filled his lungs. He closed his eyes. "Just like before," he whispered. "I couldn't save them, but maybe I can save you." The bobcat pressed her head against his chest. Her heartbeat was weak, but steady. Then, through the noise of fire and wind, came a sound, distant but distinct, the crack of rain, a storm rolling in. The world hissed as the first drops fell onto the flames. Somewhere between fire and rain, man and beast waited together, neither willing to let go. The rain came harder. At first it was only a whisper, a hesitant patter on the leaves. Then it grew, turning the fire's roar into a desperate hiss. Steam rose from the trees, as if the forest itself was exhaling in relief. Elias didn't move. His body was heavy, his lungs raw. Each breath scraped like glass. He could hear the rain, smell the smoke, but it all felt far away. He thought of his wife's face in that same storm years ago, the last time he'd held someone and failed to keep them safe. Not again, he thought. Please, not again. Something nudged his shoulder. Warm, wet, real. He opened his eyes. The bobcat was standing over him, soaked to the bone, fur clinging to her ribs. She was trembling, but alive. "Hey," he rasped. "You made it." She licked his face once, rough, quick, instinctive, and then pulled at his sleeve with her teeth. He tried to sit up, but pain shot through his ribs. His vision blurred. "Go," he said. "Get out while you can." But she didn't move. She bit harder, tugging his coat, dragging with what little strength she had left. "Damn stubborn thing." He managed a broken laugh. Thunder cracked overhead. The rain fell in sheets now, pounding the ground, flooding the dry creek where they lay. The water rose fast, cold and merciless. The bobcat backed up, gripping the collar of his coat, pulling him inch by inch toward higher ground. Her claws slipped in the mud, her breath coming in short bursts, but she didn't stop. Elias tried to help, pushing weakly with one hand. His other arm hung limp, useless. The pain in his chest grew sharper with every movement. When they reached the slope, the bobcat climbed first, turned, and looked back. Her eyes burned like twin embers through the rain. "Yeah," he whispered, "I'm coming." He crawled after her, grabbing roots, rocks, anything solid. His fingers bled where the bark tore his skin. The world tilted around him, dizzy and bright. Once at the top, he collapsed. The rain poured down his face, washing the soot away. Beside him, the bobcat stood guard, ears flattened, tail flicking, her sides heaving with exhaustion. He reached out, hand shaking, and touched her shoulder. "You saved my life." For the first time, she didn't flinch. Lightning flashed across the valley, followed by a low, rolling rumble. Below them, the fire smoldered out, smoke rising in thin ribbons from the wet trees. What had been destruction now glowed faintly, like something being cleansed. Elias laughed softly, breathless. "Guess we both made it out of hell." The bobcat lowered herself beside him. For a long time, neither moved. The rain softened to a steady rhythm, and the air filled with the smell of wet pine and ash. He turned his head toward her. "You knew, didn't you? When you came to my door that night, you knew I needed saving, too." Her eyes met his. No sound, no growl, just that same ancient stillness that had always made him feel small and human. He smiled faintly. "Maybe we're not so different." Dawn crept through the clouds, thin and silver, gentle after the violence of the night. Steam drifted off the trees, and the world seemed new, scrubbed clean. Elias pushed himself up, wincing. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go home." He took a step and stumbled. The bobcat moved beside him, shoulder brushing his leg, steadying him. Together they made their way through the wet woods, two silhouettes against the fading smoke. When they reached the ridge, the cabin came into view, still standing. The roof was blackened from ash, but the walls held. Inside, it smelled of rain and char. Elias collapsed into the chair by the fire pit. The bobcat circled once, then lay at his feet. Outside, the forest whispered, alive again. He leaned his head back, eyes half closed, and murmured, You brought the rain." Her tail flicked once, as if to say, maybe it was always coming. In that quiet dawn, he finally understood. Sometimes the miracle isn't surviving the fire, it's who pulls you out of it. For 2 days, Elias drifted between waking and sleep. Fever burned through him, turning the cabin into a blur of light and shadow. He remembered rain on his face, the crack of thunder, the smell of smoke, then darkness. When he woke, the fire was low, and the air smelled clean. The dog lay near the hearth, tail thumping once when he stirred. "Hey, buddy!" Elias rasped, voice barely there. His throat was dry as dust. He looked around. The room was quiet. The chair where she'd slept, empty. He tried to sit up, every muscle protesting. The memory hit him like a wave. The storm, the flames, her dragging him through the mud. "Where is she?" he whispered. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying, and stumbled toward the door. The world outside was washed in morning light, soft, silver, almost holy. Steam rose from the wet earth, and the trees shone like glass. He called out once, then again. His voice carried down the valley and disappeared. For a long moment, he stood there, breathing the damp air. Then he saw them. Tracks, fresh paw prints in the mud leading away from the porch. Small ones beside larger ones. 2 sets. His chest tightened. "You found her," he murmured. "You found your cub." He followed the tracks as far as the tree line. They wound through the undergrowth, over fallen branches, toward the ridge where the sun broke through the clouds. He stopped there, unable to go farther. The wind brushed his face, cool and soft. In the distance, between the trees, movement, a shadow gliding through the morning mist. Then another, smaller one trailing behind. The bobcat turned once, looking back. Her fur shimmered in the pale light, streaked with silver where the fire had singed it. For a heartbeat, their eyes met again, his full of disbelief, hers calm and knowing. Then she vanished into the forest, the smaller shape close behind. Elias stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through his boots, the ache in his chest spreading, but not from pain. He smiled, a quiet, broken, grateful smile. He turned back towards the cabin. The forest hummed softly around him, dripping branches, distant birds, life returning. Each step felt heavier, but also lighter, as if he were walking not through loss, but through release. Inside, he sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket. He could still see the ridge from here. For the first time, the silence didn't hurt. He reached for his knife and a small piece of wood from the hearth. Slowly, he began to carve. The old habit came easy, careful strokes, quiet focus. The figure took shape, 2 small bobcats side by side, one larger, one tiny, both looking toward something unseen. When he finished, he set it on the windowsill beside his wife's photograph. The rain had stopped. Outside, the world glowed in muted gold, the kind of light that came only after surviving something terrible. Elias leaned back, closing his eyes. He whispered, "You made it." The dog stirred, pressing its head against his knee. He smiled again, voice softer now. "We both did." From somewhere deep in the forest came a sound, low, wild, carried by the wind. Not a growl, not a cry, something between them. And then silence. The storm had taken his family. The fire had almost taken him. But the wild had given him something back. Not to keep, but to believe in again. Spring came slow to the mountain. The snow receded inch by inch, uncovering what winter had hidden. Rocks, roots, the pale bones of fallen branches. The air carried the smell of thawing earth, wet and alive. Elias moved through his days quietly. He mended the roof, planted a small patch of potatoes behind the cabin, repaired the fence that the storm had torn down. His body still ached from the fire, and his breath sometimes caught when he worked too hard, but he didn't mind. Pain was proof he was still here. The dog followed him everywhere now, older but loyal as ever. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low and the shadows lengthened, Elias would stop his work and glance toward the ridge, half expecting to see a shape watching him from the trees. He never did, but somehow he always felt like he wasn't alone. The villagers came once, early in the season. A few men from town, rifles slung over their shoulders, stood at the gate. They didn't step inside the fence. "Fire spread close to the road," one said. "Heard you were caught in it." Elias nodded. "Got lucky." They shifted awkwardly. "That wildcat. Rumor says she's gone. You seen her since?" He looked toward the forest. The trees were greening again, soft light filtering through the new leaves. "No," he said, "but she left her mark." The men exchanged looks, confused, maybe wary, but they didn't ask more. When they left, Elias watched until their figures disappeared into the mist. Later that evening, he sat by the fire. The carved wooden figures lined up on the windowsill beside him. He'd made more now, an elk, a fox, a pair of birds, but his favorite was still the small bobcat and her cub. He lit a candle, the flame steady in the still air, and murmured to the quiet room, "Guess the world doesn't take. It trades. Took one thing from me, gave something else back." The wind slipped through the cracks of the cabin, soft and cold, but not cruel. He poured tea for himself, the steam curling upward, carrying the faint scent of mint. He thought of Miriam again. Not the way she'd looked when he lost her, but the way she'd smiled that first spring they'd moved north. "You'd like her," he said softly, as if his wife could still hear him. "Stubborn, wild, smarter than I'll ever be." Outside, twilight settled over the valley. The forest hummed with life, birds, insects, distant movement between the trees. He leaned back in his chair, the fire painting everything in warm gold. He realized, for the first time in years, that the quiet no longer frightened him. The silence wasn't emptiness anymore. It was peace. The mountain woke early that morning. Mist rolled down from the ridge like breath, curling through the pines. The air was cool, damp, full of that sweet smell that only came after rain. Elias stepped out onto the porch with his cup of tea. The dog trotted ahead, nose to the ground, tail wagging lazily. It had been weeks since the fire, and the forest had already begun to heal. New shoots sprouted from the blackened earth, and birds nested in branches that had once been ash. He sipped his tea, watching the horizon shift from gray to pale gold. That was when he saw it, a shape on the far edge of the clearing. Still, watching. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. But then she moved. Graceful, deliberate. The bobcat. His heart thudded once, hard. She was thinner, her fur patchy in places where the fire had singed it. But she stood tall, steady. And beside her, half hidden behind a fallen log, a smaller form. Her cub. Elias didn't move. He didn't call out. He simply watched. The bobcat stepped closer, silent as shadow, until she stood a dozen yards away. The cub followed, cautious but curious, its ears twitching. Elias felt the air shift around them. Time slowed. Even the dog sat still, head tilted, sensing something sacred. "You found her," he whispered. "You did it." The bobcat blinked once, slow and sure. Then she lowered her head. Not fear, not submission, but something else. Recognition. Elias smiled faintly, eyes stinging. "You're safe now, both of you." She took another step forward. He could see the faint scar along her ribs, the mark of where she'd once bled on his floor. The reminder that survival had tied them together. even if just for a season. The cubs sniffed at the air, wide-eyed. Elias knelt slowly, resting one hand on the porch rail. "Hey, little one," he murmured. "Your mama's tougher than the whole damn mountain." The bobcat gave a low, soft sound, almost a purr, almost a goodbye. Then she turned. Elias didn't stop her. He knew better now. Some things weren't meant to be kept. They were meant to return. As she slipped back into the trees, the cub paused and looked back once, head cocked. Then both disappeared into the green, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves and the memory of motion. Elias stayed there long after they were gone, his tea gone cold in his hands. The forest shimmered in the morning light, alive and endless. He whispered, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to, them, the mountain, or something greater. A breeze stirred the pines, brushing past him like a familiar touch. For a moment, he thought he heard it again. That quiet sound from deep in the forest, halfway between a growl and a song. The dog barked once, happy, tail wagging. Elias smiled. "Yeah," he said softly. "She's home." And for the first time, so was he. By late afternoon, the mountain turned gold. The air shimmered with that soft kind of light that only came when the world forgave itself. The creek, once frozen, now murmured again. Quiet, steady, alive. Elias sat outside with a small knife and a block of cedar wood. The scent filled the air as he carved, slow and patient. Each curl of wood that fell to the ground caught the sun and glowed like tiny flames. He didn't know what he was carving at first, just followed the grain, the shape hidden inside the wood. When it was done, he realized it was a paw, small, delicate, the size of the cub's. He smiled and set it beside the others on the porch rail. The dog lay nearby, belly to the floor, eyes half closed. Every so often, its ears twitched toward the forest, as if listening for something Elias couldn't hear. He lifted his gaze toward the ridge. The snow there was nearly gone, but in the last patches that clung to the shadowed slopes, he could still see faint marks, tracks winding upward, fading at the tree line. Not new, not old, just enough to remind him she'd been real. He stood, joints creaking, and walked to the edge of the yard. The grass there was soft beneath his boots, slick with meltwater. He looked down and saw it. One last paw print, half filled with mud, glinting in the evening light. Elias knelt beside it. His reflection shimmered faintly in the shallow pool of water that had gathered inside the print. For a moment, it looked like two faces, his and hers, blurring together in the ripple. He reached out, tracing the edge with a trembling hand. "You did good," he said quietly. "Better than most of us ever could." A breeze drifted through the pines, carrying the scent of rain and pine resin. He closed his eyes and breathed it in. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Shadows moved across the walls like ghosts that had finally learned to rest. He went back to the porch and sat down, hands folded in his lap. The dog climbed up beside him, head resting on his knee. The warmth of its weight grounded him in the moment. The sky deepened to amber, then violet. The first stars blinked through the haze. Elias watched until the forest disappeared into darkness, but he didn't feel alone. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridge, a bobcat and her cub moved through the night, two silent lives continuing, wild and free. He thought of his wife again, of her voice the last time he'd heard it. "The world isn't cruel, Elias. It just doesn't stop moving." He smiled. "I know," he murmured, "and maybe that's what saves it." The wind shifted, lifting the edge of his coat, rustling through the trees. He took one last sip of tea, now gone cold, and whispered into the dusk. Goodbye. The mountain breathed, the forest listened, and somewhere in the distance, the wild answered back. The mountain changed with the seasons, as it always did. Grass covered the scars of the fire, flowers threaded through the ash, and the sound of life returned to every corner of the valley. The cabin still stood there, weathered, leaning, but alive. Travelers sometimes passed through on their way north. They'd stop to rest, maybe trade a story or two. They always said the same thing. The old man on the ridge was quiet, kind, and somehow lighter, like someone who'd made peace with ghosts. Elias didn't speak much about what happened that winter. When asked, he'd just smile, pour tea, and change the subject. But sometimes, when the fire burned low and the forest hummed outside, he'd glance toward the window and let a secret softness pass through his eyes. Once, a boy from town brought him a photograph, grainy, taken from a distance. It showed a bobcat and her nearly grown cub crossing the creek at dusk. "That near your place?" the boy asked. Elias studied the picture for a long time. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said, "something like that." He pinned the photo to the wall beside his wife's. The two images, one of the past, one of the wild, seemed to belong together. That night, he carved one last figure, this one different from the rest. A man and a bobcat, side by side, both facing the same horizon. He didn't bother sanding it smooth. The roughness felt right, like truth. When morning came, he set it on the porch rail and left it there. The rain that day was gentle, warm, almost like a blessing. Elias sat with a blanket around his shoulders, eyes closed, listening. He could hear the forest breathe. He could hear the quiet rhythm of a world that never stopped, never really ended, only changed shape. He whispered, "You saved me." And maybe, somewhere beyond the trees, something wild turned its head and listened. The wind carried the sound through the valley, soft, wordless, infinite. Sometimes, the wildest creatures remind us what it truly means to be human. Not because they need us, but because, for a brief, impossible moment, they let us remember what it feels like to care without expecting anything in return. The rain eased. The light grew softer. The world, as always, moved on. And somewhere in that moving world, between the heart of a man and the heart of the wild, a small promise stayed, unspoken, unbroken, eternal.